fancy forms that Chelsea did. Chapter 3 is a really short chapter. It'll probably only take us like 10 minutes to get through it. So then after that, I figured we'll just fill up the front and back of these. If you want, it's not like compulsory. We'll still go ahead if you don't want to. Alright, we're going to be in James chapter 3 tonight. We're going to try to get through it because most of this chapter is illustrations and several of the verses kind of just lumped together anyways. So instead of bogging down the illustrations, we'll look at them, but instead of bogging down, we'll just try to get through chapter 3 and then fill out these forms. First one, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will have a stricter judgment. Which kind of makes sense. You think about people like law enforcement, they have a little bit more authority to do things like, if I were to walk up to someone and just tie their hands behind their back, then I would be charged with a felony, like kidnapping or whatever else that would be. Law enforcement and carrying out their duties can do that, but they're also scrutinized a whole lot more, which is why they have to, a lot of times, carry a camera around on their vest wherever they go. So, as Christians, when we start to use our influence or authority to teach others, then we're actually going to be held accountable for that. We're going to be held at a higher standard, just like a law enforcement officer is held accountable for the authority that he has. So, James says, let not many become teachers because you know you will receive a stricter judgment. So at the same time, this isn't just saying that only like certain elite people who are perfect in every way should be teachers, thank goodness. At the same time, Christians are expected to become teachers. Hebrews 6, they said, you kind of just been studying the fundamental all this time. At this time, like by this point, you should be teachers already. We see this a lot with people who've been Christians even for like 40 or 50 years, and they're still talking about like baptism is what you need to be saved, which is true, but that's like the extent of their Christianity is the plan of salvation, and nothing too much deeper than that. So, while James says, let not many become teachers, at the same time we are expected to have the ability to teach if needed. So the reason he says this is in the first century, you had a group of people who studied the Mishnah. The Mishnah was that weird collection of sayings from teachers. I think we talked about that a little bit before. But these guys were elevated in society, the kind of people who were in pedagogical positions where they had their own students and people looked up to them and they were Rabbi so-and-so. Remember, this is a Jewish book. So they were Rabbi so-and-so and they had a following. They did that for power. So if you wanted to get influence, you become a teacher. That's a world stain. We're looking at having wisdom that comes from above throughout the book of James. We talked about that in chapter 1, where if you have God's wisdom, then you'll see trials on this earth the way that God wants you to see them. They're an opportunity to grow in your faith. They're not, something that God hates you for, and therefore He's putting you through all these hard times. So if you want to have authority and power as a Jew in the first century, and that's the only reason you become a teacher, then that's having your thinking stained by the world. That makes sense. Verse 2, for we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. If we can control what we teach and not stumble in it, then that makes us perfect. Basically, I think there's a little bit of recognition that when we go and talk to others about the gospel, we go out by thinking in the back of our minds, like, I'm trying to, talk about God to this person and maybe think about specific sins you maybe committed in the last week or month or whatever it is. There is a little bit of grace for us because if you're perfect, then there's really no need for salvation in the first place. So don't let that get you down. Verse 3. Now if we put the bits in the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and they're driven by strong winds, they're still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. We're shifting gears a little bit we're still talking about the tongue, obviously, in chapter 3, but James is pointing out that it really doesn't take a whole lot to change someone's destiny or your relationship with that person. One sentence is enough to completely change a relationship that you have with someone. We all can think of instances where someone using words carelessly or even with precision hurt us in ways that may still stick around. Verse 5. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, but it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. It's set among our members as that which defiles the entire body, and it sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. There's a lot of fires, and there's a lot of words, and there's a lot of run-ons, so it can be a little bit confusing. But what he's saying is that when someone speaks harshly, it can cause flames. We're naturally drawn to people who are kind, or even maybe soft-spoken, not like super quiet and like timid or whatever, but people who are just obviously nice people. We can all think of someone who's like that. We're drawn to those kinds of people. But if you see someone like Chad's or whatever in the store, and they're really not all that nice, the way that they talk is really a turn on to a lot of people. You're not going to want to grow close to something like that. All right, so when we're talking to others, when we're teaching, when we're exerting our influence, we have to keep in mind what kind of damage we can do with one of the smallest members of our body. Because that kind of stuff will stick around forever for some people. So the tongue is a fire. You can start a fire if you're really good with a spark. I always hear that. I hear the song, it only takes a spark to get a fire going. Every time I try to start a fire with a spark, it doesn't work. But the word here is halikon, or halikane, which is really describing just a small flame. So our tongue constantly is a small flame, and the way we use it can either bring someone warmth or can result in a devastating fire. So we have to keep that in mind. And going back to the context of verse 3, talking about becoming a teacher, which for us would be more the way we use our influence, we have to remember that we will have a strict judgment. So we have to keep that in mind when we use our tongue. Move on past this. Verse 7. For every species of beasts and birds, reptiles and creatures of the sea has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. So the word for tamed here means to bring into subduement is not a word, is it? No. Anyone in here good with English?
English major here, they're reading Beowulf. Is it English?
Yes.
That's a good book. I just don't know how to say subdued in this sense. Anyways, we have subdued all the animals because you're not going to find a human that has been trapped by an animal in this actual cage. I don't think. But anyways, James is saying that we have tamed. There we go. Tamed. Okay. We have tamed every species of animal that's ever been created that we've ever interacted with, and yet for some reason we can't tame our own tongues. It's kind of crazy how I think about some really powerful animals like gorillas or T-Rexes or whatever, and how hard it must have been to actually tame those. And our tongue is really tiny, and we can't keep that under control. Verse 9, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things should not be this way. The word for curse here, it's not like the same thing we think of with a curse word. It just means to wish downfall on someone else, that you just really hope bad things happen in their lives. So that's what he says. With it, we pretend that we love God, and with it, we also hope that bad things happen to other people who are made in his image, who are made in the likeness of God. Now, this may be a topic for another time, but being made in the likeness of God, every time this word is used, it's talking about the reflection that we would see in the water. It's kind of like a mirror reflection. So when we're talking about the likeness of God or the image of God, to an extent, we are made to look like God. So whether that means that our character is supposed to be a reflection of his nature, God being perfect and loving and merciful, or whether that means that we actually literally, physically, to some extent, look like God, is a matter of debate. I think the evidence seems to be more in favor of the fact that we do look, that God made us to look like him, a reflection of his physical appearance. Obviously, not exact because God's everywhere at once, but when Jesus was raised from the dead, he was raised in his resurrection body, and he was not even recognized by Mary until he spoke. He said her name. And she was like, oh, this is Jesus. But she didn't realize that just by looking at him. But he was definitely human in appearance. So, fun thought, not really relevant to the class. All right, move on. 11 and 12 is another illustration. You can't find a spring that has both good and bad water. It's either going to be good or it's going to be bad. If someone hears good words from you, everyone else should also expect to hear good words. Nothing drives me up the wall more than seeing someone who's like all sweet and nice at church, and then I see them Monday through Saturday, and they're like the meanest person you'll ever run into. If you've ever had the misfortune of having to work in retail, and you saw someone from church and they were absolutely unpleasant to deal with, it can be really disappointing. You're like, okay, I thought you were like the sweetest person ever, but actually, you're not. James does not want us to be that way. Verse 13, who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. So this goes back to the first part of the book, let not many of you become teachers. James is saying, who among you is actually smart? That word for understanding here is expert or proficient or really good at something. So if you really are all that smart and you really want to be a teacher, then in the church, show by your good behavior and your deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. Verse 14, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't be arrogant, and so lie against the truth. A wise person is a person who can control their tongue. So we think about like really smart people as being people who can just ramble on about some really complicated subject for a very long time, and they sound smart, and you're just like, wow, blown away by how smart they are. But really a smart person is someone who knows how to control their tongue. Obviously, if you know something like a lot of stuff about your subject, then you're considered intelligent. But James is saying that a wise person, let me clarify, is someone who can control their tongue. Okay, more illustrations, move on. Verse 15. This wisdom is not what comes down from above, but it's earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. Important contrast here is not wisdom that comes from above. That is the wisdom we ask God for. If you go back to chapter 1, it talks about if you lack wisdom, ask God for wisdom. He gives all willingly, without reproach. He gives all generously without reproach. But we're not. If we have earthly wisdom, it's not wisdom necessarily that comes from hell. It's just wisdom that is from here. And we think about if you guys ever watch or get involved with people who are a part of atheist organizations. Who try to posit examples of their belief system, or they try to prove their belief system as opposed to Christianity. The wisdom that they try to use is really just cleverly worded falsehood. I don't know how else to put it. It's a really long and in-depth study, but it is hard to tell sometimes, especially in the education system, the difference between what is right and what is wrong. And there's really a simple way to kind of tell the difference. If it conflicts with anything that God said, then it's probably wrong. Anything else, you're good to go. All right. Yeah, we'll go ahead and end with 17 and 18. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy, and the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. When we think of a wise person or a godly person, or what James is trying to point out, a person who is worthy of teaching, of being intelligent, we don't really think necessarily of someone who is first pure, and then peaceable, and then gentle, and reasonable, and merciful, and full of good fruits. None of this has anything to do with their credentials at all. It has everything to do with their character. Evidently, in God's eyes, it is more important that, not that one is necessarily more important than the other, but hear me out. God desires mercy and not sacrifice. He wants to see that before we are able to teach on the most complicated subjects in all the Bible, before we could write a 30-page paper on 2 Thessalonians 2 and the activity of the man of lawlessness, before we reach that level, he wants to see that his Christians are first pure, and then peaceable, and then gentle, and then reasonable, and full of mercy and good fruits, and who are very faithful, who have no hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. If you want to know how to be godly, first of all, we could look at 1 Timothy 1, I believe verse 3, or maybe it's verse 5. I think it's verse 5. to have love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. That's one way to be godly, but also to be pure and peaceful and gentle and reasonable and full of mercy and good fruits. James is awesome because it is an extremely practical book. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus did, the Sermon on the Mount is basically an abbreviated version of this. James is a commentary, if you will, on the Sermon on the Mount. So that's a fun fact. We'll go ahead and end with that. Because for whatever reason, I am dizzy as can be. So we'll stop there, and I'll pass this bundle down at the end if y'all wouldn't mind.
Get a rock star?
Huh?